Story 1. I was in middle school in typing class. The teacher stopped and just sat watching the news, and we did not know what was happening. They ended the day early and sent us home if we wanted. Story 2. I was on a plane. I was 6 years old and flying with my mom and two of my brothers from Oregon to Wisconsin. We were in the air between Portland and Seattle. I remember it clearly because when we landed, none of the screens at the gates were on. When my mom tried to ask gate agents what was happening, no one would tell us anything. It was very strange. Then my mom called my dad, and he was watching it live on the news. Story 3. At work. My birthday is also September 11th. My then girlfriend, now wife, calls me at work in a chipper voice. "Hey, how is your birthday going?" "Terrible," I said. "Really, why? You have not turned the television on yet, have you?" Story 4. Working from home, I needed to be with people, so I made phone calls and hung out at coffee shops talking to strangers about it. Then I went to give blood. Story 5. First grade. We were not allowed to talk about it in school, but I remember for a while after that, at recess, if we saw a plane overhead, we would all scream that it was bin Laden coming to get us. I did not fully understand the details until high school. When I was 6, I thought a bad man named bin Laden woke up in a bad mood one day, flew his own plane all the way from Afghanistan into one tower, backed up and hit the other one, then flew away. Story 6. I remember being asked that in class back in 2006 in the United Kingdom. Most of us had similar answers. Then we got to one boy who had moved over from the United States of America that year. His answer was on the Brooklyn Bridge. It definitely changed the atmosphere in the room. Story 7. I was in school, and we were sent home early. It was such a surreal day hearing about it all on the news. The whole world seemed to change after that. Story 8. Middle school. When a child received a call on his cell phone from his mother who worked there but was going in late because of a dentist appointment and was far enough down the West Side Highway to see it live. Story 9. Working in a government building was stressful because it was unclear how many buildings were being targeted. Story 10. In preschool, but in a bomb shelter because I am from Washington, District of Columbia. My father actually saw the plane hit the Pentagon from his office in Georgetown, so he really hates when conspiracy theorists claim there was no plane. Story 11. On my mom's lap being fed about 30 minutes away, as my dad was in the city working and my grandfather was involved in search and rescue after it happened. Story 12. Just after high school, I was getting ready to leave my house when I saw it on television. Later that month, I joined the United States Marine Corps. The rest was history. 4 years of hell. I was in Southern California, by the way. I had just graduated 12th grade. Story 13. Disney cruise. We had to turn back and dock. We went to Disney World with no lines, and all the workers were very nice. I was about 5 years old, so I did not understand what had happened. I was just having a good vacation. It is crazy to think back on. Story 14. 11th grade algebra class. We had our desks pulled together and were doing worksheets while watching the news. As I was staring, lost at the television, the second plane hit. I remember hitting my best friend's shoulder, saying, "Look, Danielle, look." I remember exactly where my desk was in the classroom and how the television hung on the wall. It really affected me. The images on the television. Story 15. 8th grade. My homeroom teacher usually had the television on before class started. Most of the time it was on ESPN so we could watch SportsCenter. This time it was on CNN. We saw the hole in the first tower and all thought it was an accident. Class started and the teacher turned the television off. A few minutes later, there was an announcement over the public address system telling teachers to turn the televisions on. The second plane had hit. We were only 12 or 13 years old. I don't think any of us understood the magnitude of what we were seeing. I didn't. Another announcement told us to turn off the televisions. I guess they thought it was too disturbing. The teacher turned off the television but told us we were witnessing history. We went about our day for a little bit and proceeded to the next class. My science teacher was a Mexican immigrant. He talked about how his family struggled to come to this country and how great it was to be in America. He also said that nothing would ever be the same. They made another announcement over the public address system. If any student had family members in New York City or Washington or someone on a plane, they needed to come to the office. We went to lunch. Rumors were swirling everywhere. They hit the White House. They hit the Capitol. The Statue of Liberty had been destroyed. We were already sending nuclear weapons to whoever did this. A few kids had left already. A little later, they let us out early. I went home. I didn't even know the towers had collapsed. I was living with my mom's cousin and her husband at the time. They were watching television and holding back tears. I went to my room to try and watch cartoons, but all the channels were showing live coverage. My dad was fine. He ended up having to rent a car and drive home since the airports were closed. Story 16. At work, I overheard my coworker's radio. The announcer was saying something about an airplane crashing into one of the World Trade Center towers. I figured it was just a general aviation aircraft pilot doing something careless and went back to work. Obviously, I was mistaken. Once I understood that we were being attacked, I knew my active duty military days were not all behind me, as I had assumed on September 10th. I was right. Eventually, the United States government called, and I found myself back in uniform and being deployed. Story 17. I wasn't alive, but I just asked my mom this the other day. She was teaching in a classroom in Manhattan. Parent ran in and grabbed their son. She asked what happened, and all he responded was, "We're being attacked," before leaving. Terrifying. Story 18. I grew up in Hong Kong, which is 12 hours ahead, so it was the middle of the night. I was 5 years old, at home, waiting for my mother to come back. She was a flight attendant and had just landed from Anchorage. I should have been in bed, but my babysitter was glued to the television and did not think to tuck me in, understandably. I saw the second plane hit and I screamed. I was so young that every time I saw a plane, I thought of my mother. Hong Kong has no shortage of skyscrapers. Eventually, my mother entered the house, expecting me to run into her arms like I always did, but she saw the television. It was the first time I ever heard an adult curse. I remember her hands on her head, and her reaction was, "Fuck!" I will never forget that day. I remember it like it was yesterday. Later that night, my primary school called all the airline families and said, "Make sure your children do not watch the television." They arranged therapy for all of us who did. It was really hard sending my mother off to fly after that. It took years to get over the anxiety. Story 19. School started late that year because of work being done in our district. I was at home, playing Diablo 2 in the battle, net channel cows when somebody said, "Holy shit, a plane just crashed into the World Trade Center." Being an 11-year-old from New Jersey at the time, things just changed. There is a really good YouTube video that shows every live television feed an hour before and about 4 hours after the attacks happened. It was like entering a time portal. The media, among many other things, completely changed almost overnight. The mood shifted. It was the day the 1990s truly ended. Story 20. Surfing in New Jersey, we knew it was going to be really good. So we drove down to the beach the night before and got in early. The surf was about as good as New Jersey gets that morning, and it was an absolutely perfect day, as most remember. People started paddling out and telling us bits and pieces of what had happened. We paddled in and made it to a friend's house in time to see the second tower come down live. I was 22. Story 21. I'm a psychotherapist, and I was at a retreat center near the Atlanta airport on the first morning of a week-long retreat for married couples who were stressed because of their vocation. It was the first day of what turned out to be a horrible week. Story 22. I was a high school teacher. My then-girlfriend told me, "I think school will be canceled today." She was right. During the following weeks, my male students asked, "Am I going to be drafted?" And "Mr. Blank, will you be drafted?" All I could say was, "I don't know, but we are safe here." I lived under a flight pattern near an airport. It was eerie and quiet. There was no draft, but many of my students enlisted or already were enlisted. High school seniors and juniors. Some made it back home. Some did not. I was in my kitchen before work when the second tower was hit. Story 23. I was in the United States Air Force. At the time, we were organizing an event, so I was going from one building to another to coordinate. In one of the buildings, everyone was gathered in an office with a television on. I did not realize the severity of what they were saying when they mentioned a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. I later learned a high school friend was on one of the planes. Story 24. I was in high school sitting in greenhouse class. Yes, greenhouse class, because I lived out in the farmlands and greenhouse class was a valid class. We were wondering why the teacher was so late. We joked that if they were very late, could we leave? It was becoming a serious topic. We all looked around, wondering who would be the first person to leave because we all wanted to leave, but none of us wanted to be the first to do it. Then again, where was the teacher? What was going on? Then the teacher came in. This teacher was fun, happy, outgoing, and just a bit weird. But now he had the most solemn look. He said nothing. He just turned on the TV to the news and sat down. We all stared. Then the announcements started. First one by one, then in bigger groups. The students were called as all the parents panicked and came to pick up their kids from school. Story 25. At work. I went straight home. I lived about 5 miles from the Air Force Base in Boston where fighter jets took off to shoot down the planes in Pennsylvania or Washington, D.C., whichever it was. It was so quiet, so when they took off, it gave me goosebumps and tears, many of them. I'll never forget that feeling. Story 26. In Germany, at the United States European Command Headquarters in Stuttgart-Vaihingen, at 2:45 in the afternoon, listening to Armed Forces Network radio coverage. Story 27. Across the river in Jersey City, literally on the first block off the Hudson River, the downtown New York City area looked like it was across the street. I used to work in 2 World Trade Center for 2 companies on the 34th and 55th floors, and was on the phone with a former colleague who said a small plane hit 1 World Trade Center and people were jumping out of windows. I had an office with a window view of the towers. That was when the second plane literally flew right over my office building, and I screamed to him, "Holy shit, here comes a second plane," and watched it smash into 2 World Trade Center. I will never forget how the plane's wings flapped as they guided it. It was insane. The plane was so low, it barely passed overhead, like it was going in for a landing. A crowd gathered in my office since I had an unimpeded view, and when 2 World Trade Center collapsed, there was a guy who just started wailing, "Oh my God, the people, all the people," over and over. Still haunts me. I lived right down the street and went home, only to see 1 World Trade Center collapse from my bedroom window. My mom and girlfriend, now my wife, worked in Midtown and had to walk over the Brooklyn Bridge to get home. Amazingly, no one from either company I worked for was killed, but I did lose 2 other friends that day. My brother-in-law, a paramedic, was a first responder and got trapped when 7 World Trade Center collapsed. He died of September 11 related causes in 2023. Story 28. Sleeping after having driven home from Manhattan the night before. I was at the World Trade Center on September 10, 2001. Story 29. Having a joint with my friend and discussing my first night working in a bar. My father was watching it unfold on the news when I got home. I thought it was a disaster movie. I couldn't believe it when my father told me what it actually was. Story 30. In a hostel in Athens, Greece, on a group vacation to see historical sites with some college friends. I remember one of them sitting cross-legged on a bed, sobbing and saying, "It's war. It's war." It was the penultimate day of the trip. Flying home the next day, I was stopped and searched 4 times while going through airport security. I had a very long beard at the time. Story 31. 5th grade classroom in the Chicago suburbs. I remember them walking in and saying, "Mr. Officer is going to be with you for a bit while you watch a science video." It was unusual but no real red flags. I asked to go to the bathroom and they let me. I was a total nerd and teacher's pet, so I was allowed to go even though some kids were denied the privilege when asked. As I walked to the bathroom, I passed the teacher lounge and saw the teachers huddled around the television, watching the news. I don't know if I actually remember seeing the towers with smoke on the television or if my adult brain has filled in the gaps, but I know they were seeing something terrible. They sent us home soon after. My mom picked me up. When we got home, she encouraged me to play with my light bright and other toys, but I remember her being glued to the news. Her and my dad. For days. They explained it to me briefly, but I hardly remember what they said. Even though I was alive for it, I feel a little detached, like when you hear about something in history, the Holocaust, Pearl Harbor, and so on, all happened before I was born. They sound terrible, but it's hard to truly feel the horror if you weren't old enough to comprehend. I was old enough to remember, but not truly old enough to understand. Story 32. I was at work. My boss in the same office space was on the phone with a vendor. The vendor had the news on in the background, and my boss had him on speaker. There was an audible gasp. Then he said, "Oh my God, a plane just hit one of the Twin Towers." A few minutes later, he said something very similar when the second plane hit the second tower. Story 33. I had the day off work. The girl I was dating called me and said a plane had hit one of the Twin Towers. I turned the television to Good Morning America right as the second plane hit. Story 34. Kindergarten. My mother said it was my first morning back to school after staying home that Friday and Monday after losing my grandfather. I was dropped off only to be picked up a couple of hours later. Story 35. It was qualifying day at the Reno Air Races. I was crew chief for one of the race planes, and we were in a hotel just getting up. We still went out to Stead Airport, thinking the day was still going as planned. About an hour later, the Federal Aviation Administration shut down the races for the year, so we went back to the hotel to watch cable news network. Story 36. Standing in my apartment living room, holding my 2-year-old, watching the plane hit the second tower live. I almost squished the baby. I knew right away my life would change, all of ours would. And it did. Things changed profoundly. Story 37. At work at my clinic having a meeting about improving patient care when someone came running in and we all went to the nearest television and watched the second plane hit the Twin Towers. Story 38. At work, I live 2 hours behind New York. I had to be in at 6 a.m. My manager came into my area just before 7 a.m. and told me to turn on the radio. We were on the second floor and overlooked a financial company. They had a television in their window all the time. My manager pointed it out to me. At one point, there were about a dozen people around that television. Story 39. Shortly after the first airplane hit, I met my girlfriend at a bar and restaurant. We watched the second airplane hit and the towers fall in a mostly silent room of stunned people. Thank God for the alcohol. Story 40. I was between jobs and turned on the television shortly before 9 to watch the Jenny Jones show. I saw a news reporter in New York City with the Twin Towers behind her, and one was smoking. I thought maybe I had it on the wrong channel and this was some disaster movie, so I double-checked. Then I started changing channels and noticed that a similar image was on every channel. It was dawning on me that this was a live shot of a real event, and I saw the second plane hit. You just could not believe what you were watching. I stayed in front of the television all day and into the night. Story 41. I had an early 8 a.m. chemistry class at my college. I had finished and was heading back to my apartment. I was listening to the Howard Stern show when they said a plane had hit one of the towers. When I got home, I woke up my girlfriend, turned on the news, and watched for the rest of the day. It was insane. Story 42. Junior high, in class. Normal day joking with friends. Suddenly, the teacher got a message by word of mouth. She then turned on the TV mounted on the wall above the blackboard in the left corner of the classroom. All 20 to 25 of us sat there in shock watching. We turned it off right before the second plane hit, about 5 minutes in. A couple of kids cried. Most didn't say anything at first. Even at that age, the instant realization that some of us would end up fighting and dying in a faraway place was there. It was discussed heavily in the days, weeks, and months following. The rest of that day, many kids checked out early and went home. I had a football game that night. I played defensive end all through school until I quit in 11th grade. Around 2:30 p.m., we got word the game was canceled that day, as well as the varsity game on Friday, until more information and safety were assured. I think we played a makeup game Monday or Tuesday and then returned to the regular schedule. It was definitely a trip. I tried to explain to my kids now, grade 15, block 10. Anyone who was around then and lived through that time remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing when it happened. Also, all the events that followed for at least 7 or 8 years. Story 43. I had just gotten home from the night shift. My wife was getting ready for work and had the television on. I will never forget that day. It was so eerie for the days afterward with no airplanes flying. We lived near a flight path for United Parcel Service at Louisville Airport. Story 44. Sleeping. I hate that. I woke up around noon to hear about everything. I worked at a store that sold newspapers. I remember every single paper or magazine. Everything was about the attack. Everything. Story 45. I was watching cable news network at 8:45 a.m. on Tuesday, and when they returned from their television advertisements, the first thing I heard was, "We interrupt this program." Story 46. Third grade. I learned later that my teacher was secretly very anxious because her father worked at the Pentagon. He was fine. Story 47. I was a freshman in my college English literature class that ended at 9:15. I was walking to the Commons to eat some breakfast and wait for my 11 a.m. class, but I never made it to that class. My mom came to pick me up from school. My sister was in the car furiously dialing her best friend over and over because she lived near the Twin Towers. She never got through. The best friend was fine, but life would never be the same. Story 48. In the air, circled Chicago for some time, then got diverted and grounded. Had no idea what was happening until I landed. Story 49. Running late for a 9 a.m. English class during my senior year of college. I hadn't turned the television on before class that morning. When I arrived, the television was on, and both towers of the World Trade Center were on fire. The professor turned off the television. Right after President George W. Bush came on to confirm it was a terrorist attack and said he would teach the rest of the class. I burst into tears, got up, and left to check on people I knew with ties to New York City, but phones had already stopped working on the entire East Coast. I turned on the television and watched the rest of the attacks unfold in Arlington, Virginia, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. I had always wanted to visit the World Trade Center and could not bear watching the towers collapse live. It was devastating to consider how many people worked in the World Trade Center, all the first responders, and the people in the Pentagon and on all the planes, and to think of so many lives lost in just a couple of hours. It was definitely the worst event I had ever experienced, and nothing has been the same since. Story 50. At a family reunion in Gander, Newfoundland, that was a strange day. We already had more than 60 people at our house, and we instantly added another 100 people who did not even know our town existed 10 minutes earlier. Story 51. I was about to go to bed. It was late, and I had just finished a shift at work. I went to bed with the television on, thinking the footage was from a movie I had not seen yet. I woke up to the Prime Minister addressing the nation. Story 52. Honeymoon in Hawaii. Most bizarre morning of my life. 5,000 miles from home, a massive time difference, and the occasion. Never felt so disconnected from reality before or since. Story 53. I was sleeping and woke up to the news on the television. I was in college at the time. I will never forget the feeling. When I finally got to visit the September 11th memorial, those feelings came back and I started sobbing while reading all those names. Story 54. 9th grade. Ms. Johnson's first period United States history. A girl came in late and said a World Trade Center tower got hit. We said, "That sucks." Because we did not realize what was actually happening. We just went back to whatever we were doing. We found out about the second tower in second period. I do not recall us watching much during the day. Story 55. 10th grade. We were going on a field trip to the state capitol, but it was canceled. All the teachers turned on their televisions or radios so we could listen to what was happening. Kids cried. Teachers talked in the hallway in hushed voices. And at some point, the school started letting our parents come pick us up. My grandparents were visiting that week in their camper but immediately left once the first plane hit because their drive home passed through New York City, and they wanted as much time as possible to avoid it. My father worked for the government and did not come home for a couple of days, so my mother sat in a rocking chair in the living room, glued to the television waiting for his phone calls. We were told to be quiet and watch television in our rooms, but I remember getting on the internet that day and immediately being bombarded with conspiracy theories, which I eagerly read because I was 15 and it was exciting to feel like I finally understood something the adults were talking about. I do not remember much else specifically, but I remember how everything changed rapidly afterward. Suddenly, President George W. Bush was admired. Everyone talked about how great it was to be an American. The military appeared at my school almost every week, and teachers became much more vocal about their politics. Once the Iraq and Afghanistan wars started, there were protests at the school almost every day, and many counter-protesters showed up after school to cause issues. Story 56. In Vienna, Austria, when McDonald's released their box of 20 chicken nuggets where we live, I was 5.5 years old. I will never forget when the new flat screens at McDonald's suddenly showed cable news network with the planes crashing into the towers. It is actually one of my first core memories, even though I am from Central Europe and had no idea what the World Trade Center was or how much of an impact this attack had globally. But the moment when everyone just stopped working and stared at the screen, I realized something was wrong. At that time, flat screens in a restaurant were something special, so when the advertising stopped and they turned on the news, it was like time stopped for a minute. I cannot even imagine how this felt for an average American because even 7,000 kilometers east, everybody froze. Meanwhile, my brother and I shared our first box of 20 chicken nuggets and were kind of lost because we were little kids and had no idea what happened. At the end of the day, one of the first things I really remember was the September 11th attack on the news at McDonald's. Story 57. Middle school history class. My teacher told us about the airplanes hitting the towers. I was confused and thought they were like small private planes or something. Story 58. In 6th grade, a teacher walked into our class, whispered urgently to our teacher, and then she announced, "An airplane has been hijacked and the World Trade Center has been hit." They wheeled in a TV cart, and we watched live as the second tower was hit. When they switched over to the Pentagon, a girl in my class lost it. Her dad was at the Pentagon that day, and that seemed to shake the teacher back to attention as she went into damage control and sent her to the office. Her dad was okay. He was in a different area, but she came back to class still very upset. The teachers had no idea what to do with us. Many students were just wandering the halls, so we ended up congregating in the girls' bathroom as she told us she had walked through that part of the Pentagon before. I had no idea what the World Trade Center was before this. I had no context for the severity of it all besides knowing my classmate's dad worked for the government and we were seeing something so incredibly serious. I don't think I had a concept of terrorism before that moment, and watching live humans stumble from the immense clouds of smoke and rubble has definitely stuck with me. Story 59. 7th grade middle school in the cafeteria. The school made an announcement, and I always knew them referred to as the Twin Towers growing up in New York, so World Trade Center did not click until I got home. My good friend at the time was Egyptian but had lived in the United States his whole life. He made an unsavory joke, which I knew was only a joke, saying, "I knocked them down." My other friend told his parents, who told mine, and they were very upset. I was told to stop being friends with him. This was the first time I had to choose between friendship and pleasing my parents. I chose the latter, and it hurt so much. I felt terrible for wanting to be his friend still and not wanting to be his friend. I found out years later they moved out of the United States, and he died while having surgery for an apparent concave chest. Story 60. 1st grade. I did not understand what was going on. My dad was part of urban search and rescue after the event, and we did not see him for about a month as he slept at the command center across the harbor in Jersey City. I was very confused at the time, and no one explained much to me until I got older and could understand what happened. Story 61. In my classroom during planning time, I was listening to local radio. They mentioned it, then I turned on the television. Most of the announcements were made when the students arrived at 10 a.m. Central Time. They announced it over the intercom a couple of times. Then we returned to teaching. Sometimes being normal is the best thing. My wife had been in New York City a week before. She went home. After about a day, we turned off the television for a few days. Story 62. In my 3rd grade class in Ontario, Canada, the teacher stopped everything to explain what had just happened. Story 63. We were on a family retreat. I was a child. We heard so much nonsense that day, so much misinformation. Story 64. I honestly do not know. The only two memories I have of that day are being at home and going into my mother's room to ask her for socks, and realizing that something serious had happened in New York City because it was on the television in my parents' bedroom. The second memory is of me being in school and hearing that my first grade teacher had been crying about the incident. The second memory seems legitimate, but the first one is questionable. The first airplane hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. However, school started at 9 a.m. for me in elementary school and went until about 4 p.m. For that memory to be accurate, I would have had to go to my mother's room to ask for socks between 8:46 and 8:48. My mother would have had to turn her attention away from this significant event to give me socks and then get me to school within 10 minutes. This is theoretically possible, as my elementary school was about a 5-minute drive from my house, but it does not quite add up. How could my mother look away from the television? Would she not have thought we should delay taking me to school for a while? Story 65. I was living 20 minutes north of the city and getting ready to go in on the train and down to the World Trade Center area for an appointment. As I was leaving my apartment, I got a call to turn on the television. Another hour and I would have been down there. Story 66. At school in second grade, Pennsylvania, USA, we were in our morning gym class when our teacher came running and saying that some of our parents were there to take us home early. When I got home, my mom had the television on the news and explained that some very bad people called terrorists were attacking our country. Story 67. First period social studies class, 6th grade. The principal came over the intercom and made an announcement about what happened. Many of our parents worked in or close to the towers. They turned the televisions on right as the first tower fell. I will never forget it. Story 68. I was in school when we watched it happen on television. I was half asleep in class, so when I watched it, I thought it was a movie. I only realized it was real when I saw other children crying and panicking. I remember getting on the bus, and everything and everyone had a strange calm feeling, like the calm before a storm. When I got home, my mother would not turn off the television. It was a strange feeling as a child. Story 69. On my way to school in 5th grade, I saw newspaper vendors on the street corners, which never happened in my Southern California neighborhood. Dad did not stop. In class, they wheeled the televisions out on carts and we all watched. There was not an overwhelming sense of fear or dread that I can remember. 5th grade is about 10 years old, so I recall some of the boys becoming fascinated with military topics afterwards for the cool factor. A couple of my friends ended up serving in Afghanistan and returned with their mental health severely affected. One of them has since pulled himself together, started a family, and I am proud of him. However, he spent years in and out of jail and struggling with substance abuse before that after returning home. Story 70. Kindergarten. I remember we were watching television in class when suddenly the teacher started panicking. Then our parents came and picked us up. I recall watching my parents standing in front of the television at night. I did not realize that was an emergency call until years later when I connected the dots and figured that must have been the day since I was in kindergarten in 2001. Story 71. I would have been on the way to school when the first planes hit. We had library day that morning, and the librarians had it on the television. 5th grade. Story 72. When I noticed in my classroom at school, it was like my 5th year teaching. We watched the second tower fall. I was sharing the room with a teacher who used to be a colonel at the Pentagon. It was crazy. He still knew people there. Story 73. School. My teacher found out while we were out for recess, and I still remember her coming back into the classroom crying and trying to explain it to us. Story 74. First day home from the hospital by myself with my very first baby. I was 20 years old. My husband had to work. I had the television off, but my husband's grandmother called me after she saw the news of the first plane hitting. I turned on the news just in time to see the second plane hit. I packed the baby up and drove the block to their house to watch the news with them. Story 75. I woke up and got some food out of the refrigerator. When I turned back to the television, the news feed had switched to the towers. I am pretty sure they were replaying video of the first airplane. Then, of course, the news reported on the Pentagon and the other airplane that crashed when the passengers fought back. There was constant news coverage. Every part of the story was being covered. All day and all night, this was the only thing anyone was talking about. It continued for most of that year and into the War on Terror and the USA Patriot Act. For a while, it felt like most of the country was on the same side. It did not last long, but there were a few days. Story 76, 222, East 41st Street, New York City, on coffee break. I am a union electrician. We thought it was a small plane incident until the second one hit. Story 77. In bed sick on a school day. I remember waking up, still in bed, and hearing my mother say, "Oh my goodness, a plane flew into a building." I initially imagined a small Cessna accidentally hitting an apartment or something smaller. Story 78. Home with my dad. Stayed home sick from school due to a random spider bite on my eye. Saw the whole thing live. Story 79. Coming home from school in the United Kingdom. I was just short of my 11th birthday. I vividly remember my mother explaining that our normal children's television shows would not be on and telling us why. I asked if I could watch, and she said that was okay but warned me I might not want to as it was very distressing. The second tower had fallen probably 30 minutes before. We only received 4 television stations, and the same news was on every channel. The only other time I remember that happening was Princess Diana's funeral. It is wild to look back and think about the profound impact that day had on the world. Story 80. It's a long, sordid story. I was getting my books from the National Cable Communications bookstore when I heard Howard Stern on my car radio in the parking lot. I thought he had finally gone too far with the pranks. I have family, former coworkers I just left to go to school, and customers from that job all in or around those buildings. Then Howard said the second tower got hit. I'm from a first responder family. I was an Eagle Scout and fire explorer. I knew if this was true, I needed to try and help. I was too young and naive, 21, to know I couldn't get close to help. But with family there, I had to try. I dropped my girlfriend off in Elmont and looked at the highway. For the first time ever, I saw zero traffic on the Cross Island Expressway, Long Island Expressway, and Grand Central Parkway. Police were at every ramp. I had to drive local streets the whole way home to Queens. You can see the Manhattan skyline from my roof. I had to see it first. Closing streets, mass media. It just wasn't enough when I have friends and family there. Nobody was picking up any cell phones. Any landlines I called were off the hook. Only the Nextel phones were working, but no one in my family had one, me included. Somehow, I flew through the local streets with zero traffic. I found parking right in front of my building and ran straight to the roof. I knew exactly where to look, as I drew that skyline thousands of times as a child. I could see the outline of the buildings, like when a movie makes a character invisible but needs to show the audience that the character is on screen. From those buildings, I saw a huge, the biggest cloud I had ever seen, shaped like Long Island, stretching from the top of the buildings to over Bushwick, Brooklyn across the East River. Howard Stern wasn't joking. Neither were any of the other morning shows on the radio that would normally be playing pranks at that time. Where was my brother? My godmother? My best friend and his parents? They owned an internet company on Broad Street that I had worked for, and we always got breakfast and lunch while hanging out at Barnes & Noble at the World Trade Center. How could I help? All transit was suspended, all of it. I have to take my bike. I could do like I used to as a kid and go through the mud tunnels under the Queensboro Bridge. But then I would have to carry my bike across the mud tunnels across the river, and I didn't know where the tide was at. The internet wasn't as good as it is today, and phones weren't as smart. By the time I would make it to the scene, I had no badge to get me through. The press would be trying to get coverage. The oxygen tank and mask were at my dad's garage back in Long Island. I didn't have the gear to go in safely and find my brother. All of this was going through my mind. I went downstairs to get my scanner and listened. I heard they were marching everyone home across the bridges to evacuate the island. I'll wait at my brother's. That's all I can do. He eventually came home. His bright blue rocker hair was gray and white. He looked like a World War I shell-shock soldier. He was caked in dust, ash, and building debris. Phones still didn't work. He started work at 8 a.m. He was home by about 9 p.m., walking all the way from the New York Stock Exchange to Woodside in new rock boots. I was so relieved and numb at the same time. What about those who didn't make it? Who did this? Why did they do it? Same people from the 1993 bombing? Our dad was on that call. We're going to go to war. This couldn't have been domestic. I literally purposely failed the Marine entry exam because I talked myself out of it during the test, thinking it was too peaceful. Now I would be first deployed. Where would I be sent? It was the world's most perfect weather day. I even said that when I got into my car to go to class. It was too cinematic. I don't like to think about that day and how absolutely useless I was to help anyone. This is the last time I will tell this story. Story 81. I was nursing a hangover. My best friend called me and asked if I had the news on. I said no. He told me to turn it on, and I could not move. I was in shock. I called friends in England, and they too were in shock. I then called my aunt in Honolulu, and all she could say was she never thought this would happen again. She saw the Pearl Harbor attack. Story 82. Our hotel was near 42nd Street in Manhattan. We were 3 young women from Munich. Many other international Michael Jackson fans were in New York at that time, staying in different hotels because Michael Jackson had given 2 shows with his brothers at Madison Square Garden on September 7th and 10th. There were rumors that he would go to the tavern on the Green in Central Park after the show. He did not, but because of these rumors, we stayed up rather late. When one of us went downstairs to get breakfast from the shop next door, everything had already happened. She did not really understand what was going on. They had the radio turned on very loud in that shop, and it was talking about planes hitting buildings. She took that for a new movie in the making until she saw the reaction of everyone else. They were all trying to make phone calls, but could not because the mobile phone antenna had been on the North Tower of the World Trade Center. When she came back, she turned on the television. That is how I learned about it. Story 83. In the operating room getting my gallbladder removed, hoping the doctors were not too distracted while they performed the surgery. Story 84. Northwest Canadian town. In 8th grade, we watched it on the news. Then they evacuated all of the schools and everything because they had to divert and land a couple of suspected hijacked airplanes. It was interesting. Story 85. In middle school, we went into lockdown and we all knew something was wrong, but we were not alerted at all. My grandmother picked me up, and she was a nervous driver who never turned on the radio. I knew something was wrong because it was blasting. When I said, "What?" she screamed at me not to talk. I was only told in the car what had happened. Story 86. 6th grade. Mrs. Hall's class. I was the only one in the classroom looking at the television when the second plane hit. Story 87. First week of high school. I grew up in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia area. So many friends and peers had parents who worked at the Pentagon, only a few miles south. We went into lockdown for a few hours, then were allowed to go home early if we wanted. We were all pretty shaken, like the rest of the country. Story 88. At home, my children were playing when my father called and informed me. I turned on the television and watched, but what I was seeing did not sink in. Story 89. I'm on the West Coast, so it was around 6 to 6:30 a.m., and I was on my way to work. On the radio, I heard that a plane hit the World Trade Center and thought it was a small commuter plane. When I got to work and booted up my personal computer, I went to CNN and spent the rest of the day there. I don't remember if work gave us the option to go home or not, but I doubt it. Story 90. I was at work and about 9 months pregnant when it happened. I remember it was on a Wednesday because the following Wednesday I had my oldest son. Story 91. In Lander, Wyoming, in a motel where I had stayed the night, I was on vacation, intending to head up through Grand Teton National Park and then to Yellowstone. I woke up that morning and turned the television onto the Weather Channel to see what the weather was going to be like that day. The presenters seemed to be acting strangely, and then one of them mentioned that all the planes were grounded. Upon hearing that worrisome news, I switched to cable news network, not long before the second tower collapsed. Not knowing what else to do under the circumstances, I continued with my vacation. I have pictures of Old Faithful taken on September 11th. The events in New York City cast a shadow over the vacation, and at times I was concerned about whether I would be able to make it back home. Much of the time while driving through Wyoming, I could not get any news over the car radio because there simply was not either a frequency modulation or amplitude modulation station I could find. Eventually, I made it back just fine, but the contrast between the natural beauty around me and the horrors of the 4 plane crashes formed conflicted memories. Story 92. At my parents' house, they called me in to see the plane hit the building. I got there as the 2nd plane hit. Glad I am in Canada. Story 93. In a San Francisco hotel on business. Did not get back home to North Carolina until Saturday midnight. Saw the 2nd plane hit live on television. Story 94. I honestly do not remember, though I have been told by my parents that I was kept in school. I was in kindergarten at a Christian school because they knew it was safe. The year it happened was 2001. My current 29-year-old self agrees with that decision for the state of the world in 2001, but not in 2025. If something similar were to happen in this state of the world, I would not keep my son in school. Story 95. I was in religious education class at school. My teacher wheeled in a television and put the news on. Everyone watched in silence. It is one of my core memories. I do not remember anything else from school so vividly. Story 96. I was 6 years old and getting ready for school. I saw my parents watching it unfold on television, and I thought it was a movie at first. Story 97. In 1st grade music class, another teacher came in and whispered something into the music teacher's ear. She audibly gasped, covered her mouth, and started crying, which was very unusual for this teacher. The other teacher then shuffled us into our main class. Naturally, we started asking questions to our primary teacher. She brushed it off and said, "Oh, just some planes that crashed into a trade center in New York. Her daughter is in New York, so she's a little worried. I'm sure everything is fine." We attended a school with a large Muslim population, so kids started getting pulled out by their parents one by one, including me. People were very worried, and even my very liberal mother, who has a Muslim best friend, was not taking any chances. Story 98. In 5th grade, I feel like when it comes time for everyone to tell their stories, I'm the only one who was at school and told almost nothing. This was in the Pittsburgh area, so it must have been around the time that United Airlines Flight 93 was in the air. Apparently from around 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time to 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Oddly, I remember this occurring closer to 11 a.m., but who knows? They called a code red, and we had to basically huddle in the back of the classroom, turn the lights off, cover all windows, and be quiet. We had practice drills before, but we stayed in this code red for probably around half an hour, so we knew something was wrong. In hindsight, this obviously wouldn't have helped matters at all, but I guess they felt like they had to do something. After that, the rest of the day was in code yellow mode. Class could continue, but the windows stayed closed, and nobody went outside. Felt kind of pointless, but whatever. Multiple kids had their parents come and get them, but the adults didn't tell us anything until it was almost time to go home, when my teacher told us that there was a plane crash in New York and to ask our parents what happened. When I got home, my mom had the television on, and that's when exactly what happened became clear. It was shocking, but I wasn't deeply affected until they showed video that was purportedly of people in other parts of the world celebrating what had happened. I guess there's some group that says this footage was from another event, but this is just my experience. I'm not here to dispute what the footage actually was. That just broke me because even at that age, it was obvious that everything about what happened was just wrong. Apparently, Arby's was open because we went there for dinner. The only other thing I remember about that night was a television channel playing the only X-Men movie at the time, and I watched that instead of the worst thing to ever happen on loop for another 2 hours. In hindsight, I don't blame the school for trying to conduct the day as normally as possible. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.